Well, good morning and happy Easter to you. I personally, once again, love Easter, and I personally love the resurrection, and I'm a little bit sad this morning because next Sunday we get back to the regular series and not focused on the resurrection, but with communion every Sunday, we're constantly focused on the resurrection, right? Did you have to, in school, read the book The Crucible or see the 1996 movie The Crucible? It is a dramatization of 17th century Salem witch trials in the States. And there were a group of girls, and they would do these great big charades in front of the court and whatnot, and they would accuse various people of witchcraft. And they would faint, and they would do all this stuff. And the judge was very sympathetic towards them, believing that people in the community were practicing witchcraft and hurting them and whatnot. Now, at one point in the play, and one point in the book, one of the girls, Mary Warren, is confronted and admits that it's all a game. It's all for show. And what we have there is an excellent example of psychologically what we call group think. That is where you're part of the group, and therefore you go with the group, whatever the group is doing. She, the girl who is going to tell the truth, begins to say it's all an act, it's all games. The girls turn on her and begin to accuse her of witchcraft and selling her soul and things of that nature. And remember that the judge is sympathetic to these girls. And so the judge begins to believe. Well, with the noose tightening around her neck, Mary Warren switches sides again very quickly and says, he led me astray. I almost signed the devil's book. I'm with them. They're all witches and da-da-da-da-da. When confronted and faced with life or death, she switches back. And it's interesting to me that the majority of the apostles, the majority of the followers of Jesus, we have ancient traditions that they all died a martyr's death, save John. This morning, we are looking at Thomas, and there are ancient traditions regarding Thomas, and this is fascinating to me. In the Bible, we only have the fate of two of the apostles, Judas, and then in the book of Acts, James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John. And they're the only two that we know from a biblical witness what happened to them. There's ancient traditions that Thomas made it all the way to India and possibly to China and died in India. And what's fascinating about that is the church records we have on it is one thing, but when the Spanish went to India, they found native Christian tribes. Those native Christian tribes held to the belief that their ancestors had been taught by the Apostle Thomas. Now, we don't know for sure, but that's good witness that both the church had this tradition and the locals had this tradition. And to that, I say maybe there's a very good chance. Now, when I say Thomas, what immediately comes to mind? Doubting Thomas. However, I want to go back to John chapter 11. And I want us to see something that perhaps we should also remember Thomas for. This is John chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, to him, saying, Lord, behold, him whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness will not end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, Jesus stayed 2 days longer in the place he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let's go to Judea again." Verse 8, the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews who were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If one walks in the day, he does not stumble because he has the light of this world. But if anybody walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." And he said to them after he said this, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go there so that I may wake him out of sleep." The disciples then said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, then he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Therefore Thomas, who is also called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go so that we may die with him." Thomas is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the disciples list, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke never mention him again. John gives us this episode, and so we're confronted with the depth of this character. He's not a one-dimensional character. Now, I wonder, is Thomas, and feel free to think about this, is Thomas a realist or is he a pessimist? And the difference is they tend to say that a pessimist looks at the situation and can only think of the negative, whereas a realist, they say that they can look at the situation objectively and they can think out both the positive and the negative, but the real of it. Now, with this one episode, I find it hard to pin Thomas down. Is he a pessimist with this statement, or is he a realist with this statement? It's clear that he didn't understand what Jesus just said. If you walk in the light, you will not stumble. And hint, Jesus is the light. But he's convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. And he's going to follow him, even going back south, going back down, let us agree, to Jerusalem. Let's go with him that we may die with him. Flip with me to John chapter 20, and this is the resurrection account in John. We'll pick it up in verse 19, and we will go to verse 25. So when it was evening of on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." Verse 20, and Jesus had said this, he showed them both his hands and his side. The disciples then rejoiced when they saw the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed upon them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Verse 23, "If you forgive the sins of any, their sins have been forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, then they have been retained." But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all contain, at least on 3 different times, places where Jesus says to the disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to get betrayed. I'm going to get beaten. I'm going to get crucified. I'm going to come back from the dead. And all three times in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke account, you and I read that, and we go, he's predicting his death. But the text often says, but the disciples did not understand what he was saying. Have you ever read those passages and gone, what's wrong with you guys? He just said clearly what's about to happen. You've got to understand that the disciples growing up in Second Temple Judaism, in their community, going to temple, going to Sabbath, going to Saturday school, because they didn't have Sunday school then, they were always told Messiah is coming, and when Messiah comes, he's going to be a descendant of David. He's going to fix everything wrong with the temple. He's going to restore true Davidic kingship on earth, bringing in the kingdom of God, peace, the enemies of God defeated, all wrongs turned to rights, evil vanquished. That's what they were all expecting. That's what they were all looking for. And they weren't looking for a dying Messiah. There was no such thing as a dying Messiah in Second Temple Judaism. And you've got to remember, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is very parabolic. He's often telling you a story, and you're supposed to find the deeper meaning in this story. And you've got to remember, in John, he's often metaphorical, and you've got to figure out, well, he's not literally a door, so what is he? He's saying that he guards the way. So the disciples are sitting there going, okay, if this is a parable, what is crucifixion in a parable? And if this is symbolism, what does I'm going to die mean? And so they are scratching their heads at this, so much so that even when Jesus is dead, here in this very episode, the disciples are amazed. And they get to see the marks of the nail, and they get to see the spear hole in his side, and they rejoice. But Thomas, for some reason, isn't there. And we're not told why Thomas isn't there. And I wonder why Thomas isn't there. So I'm going to ask you, has Thomas disconnected? And is Thomas out having an existential crisis? He knows that his Messiah, he believed that this was the Son of David who was going to restore Davidic worship and the kingdom of God, but he's dead. He's dead. He failed. Is Thomas disenfranchised and out wondering, what have I done with the last 3 years of my life? Or did Thomas draw the short straw and he was standing in line at Subway picking up the order for the group when this happened? I don't know. I'm offering you options. I'm not positive that they had a Subway in Jerusalem at that point, so there's that. Flip with me very briefly to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, the disciples have gotten themselves into trouble with the Sanhedrin. They've been asked, who are you teaching in the name of? And they're against this Jesus fellow and so forth. And they're looking to punish these guys. And a Pharisee named Gamaliel speaks up, chapter 5, verse 36 and 37. And this is Gamaliel talking. And he said to them, men of Israel, take care what you propose to do to these men. 36, for some time ago Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined with him, but he was killed and all of his followers were dispersed, and it came to nothing. 37, after this man, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some people after him. He too perished, and all those who followed him were scattered. Now, these are just two examples in the Bible of messianic pretenders that are roughly contemporary to Jesus. We know of a few others that they always got themselves killed. And I love the way that the British theologian N.T. Wright puts it. In the first century, if your favorite Messiah gets himself crucified, you have two choices: either go home and stop following Messiahs, or get yourself a new Messiah. And we have record of them doing this. We just mentioned Judas the Galilean. He gets killed, but if you remember, after the first Jewish-Roman War, after the destruction of Jerusalem, when the Jews have conquered Herod's Masada, the desert fortress, and they all hide out in there, and eventually the Romans build a ramp up to it, but they've all committed suicide inside. The guy leading the Masada revolt was either the son or the nephew of this Judas of Galilee. And so now he's the Messiah. But it's different when it comes to the disciples, isn't it? The disciples, they're tempted to go home. I'm suggesting to you that maybe at this point, Thomas is calling Mom and saying, "Mom, can you come get me?" "Yeah, sorry." I don't know, maybe. But they never go and find James, the brother of Jesus, and say, "James is the new Messiah." They never do anything like that. In fact, they are the only messianic group that you know anything about. How many of you have ever been to the Church of Theudas? How many of you have ever been to the assembly of Judas the Galilean, or know of any church building of theirs? No, they have no following today. They died. They were a failed Messiah. Now, Thomas, can I share with you that I personally identify with Thomas? Thomas has a very special place in my heart, and Easter has a very special place in my heart. If you know my testimony, I was confronted with the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And I was confronted with, okay, why did this small group of Jews go around saying that this guy had come back from the dead, and how were they able to change the world if it was a hoax? And so I spent many hours trying to disprove the resurrection. That was my beginning point, to disprove Jesus' resurrection. I kid you not, when I was a little kid going to church, I remember one Sunday a priest saying, "You want to destroy Christianity, show Jesus is still inside the tomb and Christianity falls." And I held on. Isn't it odd the things you remember from one church service throughout your life? That's interesting, isn't it? I held on to that and I thought, well, no, I think he's on to something. Because if Jesus stayed in the tomb, then he wasn't the Messiah. He was a failed Messiah. And so I spent a great deal of time not believing the witness of the apostles. They say that Jesus came back from the dead, but why should I believe them? What evidence can you give me that I should believe them? Let's flip back to John chapter 20, verses 26 through 29. 26. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and he stood in the midst of them, saying, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger and see my hand, and reach here with your hand and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Now, there is a very famous piece of artwork. Can I get that picture up here, please? Have you seen this? One of the more famous pieces of artwork from the Renaissance era. I want to ask you, what is Thomas doing in this picture? He's actually sticking his finger into Jesus' side. We just read the passage. Does this reflect something that was said in the passage? No. He didn't actually have to touch him, did he? when he saw it, it was enough to convince him, you're standing right in front of me. You have the marks from the crucifixion, and you're speaking to me. I've told you guys about this before, and you should watch for this in Greek writing, the inclusio. And we do this sometimes in our movies. We have an early phrase early in the movie, and if you watch towards the end of the movie, you might hear that phrase, or you might hear that hint again. John begins his gospel. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And right away, we're confronted with a bit of a puzzle. How can the Word, in Greek the logos or logos, how can the Word be with God and at the same time be God? John continues, still in John chapter 1, verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And we saw his glory, the glory of the only begotten from the Father, full of truth and grace. And then here in John chapter 20, verse 28, Thomas says, my Lord and my God. The gospel begins with identifying this Logos as God, and it almost ends with Thomas being the pivotal character in the John story of connecting this, who is this mysterious Word that could be with God and somehow also be God. Thomas is putting the pieces together for you, just in case you haven't put them together yet. And John is trying to tell his audience, I want you to interpret everything from verse 1 to 20, verse 18. Everything in between those two, interpret it all between these two statements. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and he says to him, my Lord and my God. Do you know about Watergate? Did you hear about that? It was a pretty big news story. Watergate and breaking into the enemy's political headquarters and so forth. And there was people sworn to secrecy and sworn to silence. And the conspiracy begins to unravel. And when they are confronted with jail time, not confronted with death, not confronted with crucifixion or being killed by a spear or being flayed alive, but threatened with jail time, they immediately are ready to tell on everybody else to save their own neck. Isn't that interesting? That the disciples, if the resurrection were an invention, the disciples would know about it, right? Because they're the ones that invented it. And when threatened with death, you would think if they invented it, at least one of them would be ready to turncoat and say, nope, they made it up. I was barely involved. Let me sneak away. But that's not what happened, is it? These men who had been raised on the idea Messiah is coming. When he comes, he's going to do all these things. And their worldview is shattered with the death of their Messiah. And yet something happens that changes them into the world's largest evangelistic outreach. What happened? They saw the resurrected Jesus. There's this fellow, he's mentioned in the book of Acts, and then he gets his own book. His name is James. And in Galatians, he's the only fellow in the entire Bible who's mentioned as the Lord's brother. He's the only one that's mentioned as the Lord's brother. And in John, it's pretty clear that the brothers don't believe him. And I can relate to them on that front. I have two brothers, and I am absolutely convinced neither one of them are the Messiah. And I testify before you, knowing them, that they are not the Messiah. Now, if, and don't do this please, if my brothers were publicly executed, don't kill my brothers, please. And I was to see that my brothers were publicly executed. And then I was to have an encounter with one of my brothers raised from the dead. Perhaps my story would change, and perhaps I'd be ready to tell you, nope, I think I was wrong, my brother's the Messiah. That's exactly what we see from James. And I ask you, if you have a brother, would it take something like that to convince you that your brother is the Messiah? Now, another thing that testifies greatly to this, we begin to see in the book of Acts, the Jesus movement begins as a Jewish messianic movement. But as the book of Acts goes on, Christianity becomes something different, something unique from Judaism. So much so that within a generation or two, Nero could identify Jews and Christians by their practices, by their things. Now, you are raised as a Second Temple Jew from very young on that you are the chosen people. You are the elect. God chose Abraham. He spoke to Moses. And we are the people of God. And now, in the first century, to be saying we missed the Messiah, and to be willing to be put out of the synagogue, to be willing to be shunned by your community for your belief that Jesus was the Messiah. How many of you are willing to undergo ostracization, being taken out of the will, being forsaken by your family because you believe this fellow was the Messiah? What would it take to get you to go from heartbroken and defeated disciples to standing ready to praise God, tell everybody he's the Messiah, go to the grave over it, perhaps seeing him alive afterwards? Would that convince you? Would convince me. How did I become a Christian? I became a Christian because I was convinced there's no other answer. Jesus came out of that tomb. Jesus rose from the dead. How did Jesus rise from the dead? The early church says that God did it. That makes sense to me. We were having a class here a couple of weeks ago, and we have the defibrillator back there. And our instructor told us that when the heart stops beating, you have this very narrow window. That if you use this machine, and it can jumpstart your heart, so to speak, but you only have this very little window to do this. Because after some point, you can't do it anymore. The heart has stopped beating, the brain has stopped, blood has stopped, everything has stopped, and after that point, it's game over. Jesus was so dead that they put him in a tomb. He had suffered crucifixion. And yet 3 days later, people see him and are convinced he's the Messiah. He hasn't gone to the hospital. He hasn't received medical treatment. I want you to think this through. You've got wounds on your feet and on your hands. You've got to get out of this tomb. Do you have the strength to move this great big rock with these wounds? Can you walk on your feet after they've been pierced? Somebody ever came up with this idea that inside the tomb were these secret balms and herbs. If there are secret balms and herbs that can make a crucified victim look like a living dude in just 3 days, why aren't we using those herbs and balms today? Where are these herbs and balms? Okay, maybe Willie Nelson has them, but that dude has been the same age my whole life, I swear to you. My life was changed that Easter Sunday because I was convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. And I kid you not, hand to God, the pastor at the church I went to, and I went there to impress a girl, not to get saved. True story. The pastor preached grace. I sat there knowing that Jesus had always been crucified, but for the first time in my life, somebody explaining why he was crucified, explaining salvation to grace. I sat there going, this guy has discovered the greatest theological loophole of all history, and does God know about it?